So welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So we're back with episode 43, and I'm super excited to welcome on Lucas Dickey, who is currently the co-founder and chief product officer at Fernish. If you're not familiar with Fernish, it is a leading marketplace for home furniture and decor rental, and has raised over $45 million from some of today's top angels and funds. So it's a super interesting marketplace. And if you know me, I'm also really interested in home design and decor. So really excited to have Lucas join us here today and learn more about it. So Lucas, welcome to the group chat. And it's great to have you join us here today as a guest. So we have quite a bit to talk about with Fernish as a marketplace. But before we do, maybe if you could start off by sharing a little bit more on your background and what led you to start Fernish, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me, Mike and team. So my background, I always say that it was like anchored at my time at Amazon. I always talk about it as being my paid MBA because living in the world of Amazon, you are very much ingrained in all the best practices of the sort of things you would learn in an MBA program. And it was right around the time that honestly MBA or Amazon was kicking off its big MBA acquisition over the course of the early 2000s. So it worked out nicely for me. So I was there when they brought Amazon MP3 to market, which was their digital music offering, and then expanding that internationally over something like, I think, 19 countries while I was there. And then brought a product called Cloud Drive to market, which still exists, but it's heavily integrated into kind of the Kindle and other Amazon device ecosystem. If you take a photo with an Amazon device, it's going into the Cloud Drive, right? So their consumer cloud offering, which meant I got to pitch to arguably one of the biggest marketplace people ever, because went through the Jeff Bezos S-team pitch process. And ultimately, got to work with a number of people in that process who went on to become either investors or employees of the company, including Furnish's now president, COO, and board member, Kristen Smith, who was my boss at Amazon, actually. Or Jeff Wilkie, outbound consumer CEO at Amazon, was SVP of North American retail at the time. So he would have been my S team member at Amazon, who would have been the advocate that brought us to Jeff B and the rest of the team. So that was the anchor of my career. I had a couple of years of experience prior to that. And then I went to just a series of back-to-back VC-backed companies. I moved down to California. I did the Bay for about a year and a half in another digital music-based business, building software for a bunch of platforms that are obsolete at this point, including things like WebOS, for anyone who remembers WebOS, or Intel was developing an operating system called Tizen, built on top of Linux, that I think they only ever retailed in India and China. So a lot of fun stuff there. And then I made my way down to LA, where I worked my way into the ad tech space. And then went through ad tech for about 4 years. And then I went into movie ticketing, and then I went to a live events, and then I landed in Fernish as a business. Fernish came about through me meeting my co-founder, Michael Barlow, at Atom Tickets, movie ticketing platform meant to compete with Fandango. Michael being employee number, 14 or something, and I think I was employee number 19, brought on to build the ad ecosystem for them, right? So ideally, we'd have generated a bunch of profitability off of ads. And then I left to go to a company called Rival, which has since been acquired by Ticketmaster. And talk about another marketplace environment, right? And had studied extensively all the other ticketing marketplaces at the time. But Michael came to me while I was at Rival and said, I've got this idea, right? Like, my girlfriend at the time, who became his fiance, now his wife, was graduating from Northwestern in north of Chicago, and he's like, she bought all this adulting furniture, right? She'd moved a number of times and finally went and spent on CB2 and West Elm and got the things she wanted. Fast forward 2 years, she's graduating, and she's like, I got a job offer in California. I need to get to LA in the next 2 weeks. I need to figure out how to flip this furniture that I dropped $6,000 on. How do I do that? She tried to do it as quickly as she could with Letgo and some other local marketplaces there, including ones that the students were operating at the university, and ended up getting pennies on the dollar, or ended up leaving a bunch of furniture out on the curb for the disposal, waste management to come pick it up. That replicated an experience Michael had 6 years prior to that, right? Or a number of years prior to that, when he was a M&A banker at JP Morgan in Manhattan, and he was moving up and down the island. And he found that unfortunately it was cheaper for him to buy furniture, dispose it, move, buy furniture, dispose it, and move than it was for him to pay a moving company. Because if he bought from IKEA, he could do a 1-bedroom apartment or sharing with a bunch of guys for fairly inexpensively. And it kind of propagated that whole kind of fast fashion furniture oriented lifestyle, which he ultimately realized, like, this is not what I want to do. I don't like that I'm throwing away this furniture, after a single use, or that I'm sharing it with friends and we decide to splurge and buy a slightly nicer sofa. We split it 3 ways. Fast forward 12 months, we're going our separate ways. Nobody wants the sofa. Who's gonna buy out the other 2 guys? It's already depreciated as an asset. I don't want to hold it anymore. So, he doesn't talk about the story as much anymore, but in the early days he did quite a bit. They cut the sofa in half because it was the only way to get it out without disassembling it. They didn't want to keep it anyways. They cut it in half and shoved it out into the back alleyway. And he's like, this just clearly is not a sustainable way to be operating my life in terms of buying and throwing away. And so from a sustainability perspective, he's like, I just don't want to do this anymore. But from a different perspective, he's like, I know psychologically the moves are one of the top most anxiety inducing or stress inducing things that someone can do in your life. It's like death, taxes, marriage, divorce, and moving, right? It's some combination of those. And obviously these days, COVID, unfortunately. So taking COVID aside, the other secular trends that have been around for a long time. And he said, like, how do we make it, our mission being, how do we make it effortless to create a home? So we wanted something to enable people to flexibly extend, move between homes without having to dispose furniture in the process, and ideally do like no lifting. So we have white glove delivery, and this is probably a lot longer you were looking for here, Mike, but it's a furniture subscription platform, which is not a new business. Calling it subscription makes it new. Furniture rental has been around since the 50s and 60s, and Berkshire Hathaway has a company called Court, for anyone who's ever done consulting or banking or anything else where your employer was willing to pay for your furniture. Court was probably the company you were working with. And it's a very healthy business, which is why Berkshire is happy to have it as part of the ecosystem. Rent-A-Center was on the opposite end of the spectrum. It was a lot more, I'm going to use this word, hopefully there's no lawyers on the call, but a bit usurious in their practices and taking advantage of folks. And there's now laws in many states that exist because of Rent-A-Center's practices. It was somewhat predatory lending oriented. And so you'd end up paying 3x retail to pay off some furniture. And this was folks who generally were cash strapped and credit constrained, who were taking advantage of the folks who were the most disadvantaged. And we said, well, we certainly don't want to be Rent-A-Center. Court's not our model. Ours is something in between, and it's probably a generation who knows absolutely nothing about furniture rental, right? And we were right. 98% of the people we interviewed had never even heard of furniture rental. The 2% who had, half of them were bankers and consultants. The others happened to have lived through the 80s and remembered seeing a bunch of NFL commercials about Rent-A-Center when Rent-A-Center used to be spending heavily in the marketplace. So we are a furniture subscription business operating out of all of Southern California now, because we expanded to include San Diego as of this last Monday, last week. So we've got north of the valley in LA down to the Mexican border in San Diego. We've got the Seattle and surrounding suburbs, and some other imminent markets coming up. So that was a very long-winded intro.
No, that was great. Thanks for sharing more with us. So that's quite the story about starting it, and I think we can most of us here can relate with some of the challenges with furnishing our homes. So I did have a question, and that's, in the early days when you kind of saw this need firsthand and you kind of set out to build Fernish, what were those initial kind of steps like as you look to kind of, build the initial kind of marketplace and validate it?
Yeah, so, we clearly are steeped these days in the language of like Eric Ries, lean startup, and in my case, steeped in the kind of Amazon tradition. So I will admit that Michael and I had an easier go for first-time founders than many other first-time founders. And I say that with being first-time founders who didn't have some sort of like massive liquidity event. I was not employee number 5 at, Twitter, or employee, 1 through 100 at Google. And I didn't have that network to be able to leverage in the Bay. But what I did have was, like, I was 35 years old when we started this business, and Michael had an extensive network. So the both of us had pretty good networks, and we had in particular good networks around people who understood like identifying whether a market existed, with the two of us not having marketing, like extensive marketing backgrounds. My background's in product management, so I have to know somewhat marketing for my job and product market fit. But I didn't have extensive user research data or experience in order to get at that. So we leveraged some folks on that end. Logistics and operations is obviously pretty heavy in a business that has physical goods that you have to move. And while I mentioned I was at Amazon, I never actually shipped a physical good when I was at Amazon, because I was in the digital product category, right? So that was where we turned to, my ex-boss, who digital was at the tail end of her career at Amazon. She used to open fulfillment centers for Amazon and would jet around the country with Jeff Wilke, picking out places to put fulfillment centers and what became 4 deployment centers, and just extending their hub spoke model, and, milk runs and all the other logistics and supply chain oriented language. She went to MIT and did a specialty program with an MBA with focus on supply chain, right? So we found smart people like that, or the former director of operations at Wayfair, director of inventory planning at Wayfair, who was an ex-Amazonian, right? So we said, how do we find all these people who know things that we know nothing about? I know plenty about building and shipping software, like anything associated with that. Michael knows plenty about banking, like leverage finance, different interesting finance instruments, had done corp dev, investor relations, things of that nature. What we lacked was that operations knowledge or muscle in-house. And so we doubled down on that initially. But we did have the benefit of me having written plenty of press release plus facts at Amazon, these 6-pagers that are now obviously entering the popular lexicon, especially with a number of books coming out right now. And use that press release to pitch a vision to a number of investors who said, I get it. Like, just like all of us on this call, it resonated. If anyone, didn't own your home, it was something you probably did sometime relatively recently, because we looked into research. So some of the kind of validation we did independent of what I would think of as more like anecdata. So we interviewed 60 people one-on-one, hour-long interviews. And then we went to about 400 people on a survey base. And then me being the product guy was like, I'm still not sure it's statistical significance. We need more data points, right? So we looked into data from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, who captures moving data in and out of cities, because it has an impact on workforce and workforce development, and which industries are going to wax and wane based upon behaviors. And so, long story short, we went really deep into that before we quit our day jobs. Like, we did all the market research before we built a single thing. Then we went on a crazy lark. This is a bit of an aside. I'm going to tell a story though anyways, Mike, because it's always fun. Michael and I knew absolutely nothing about furniture, like nothing about furniture. And so the joke in the early days was like, we were the 2 guys with more experience in movie ticketing than anyone else in the furniture industry, because clearly, like, there's no relationship to those 2 businesses, right? But in a very small coincidence, Michael's sister happened to teach school at a private school in High Point, North Carolina, which most people don't know is the furniture capital of the world, not just the United States, but the world. So there's, multiple other places that are pretty prominent, but that is the big marketplace that people come to twice annually. And his sister said, hey, what if we got you to go to this event? It's in like 2 weeks. Do you think we can get you there? And Michael's like, I can figure it out. Do you know anybody? Turns out the chairman of the event is their student, goes to her school. So we work our way in. Michael goes in with 3 separate badges. He's a vendor. He's a speaker. I think he basically had every badge possible because of the relationship with his chairman. And he just managed to bounce his way between all of these events, gleaning all the information he could, telling people, oh yeah, we have this company called Fernish, which at the time it had ED at the end of it. And by the way, I had just printed those business cards a week before and shipped them to him in High Point. I had just spun up a landing page, bought the domain name. I did it all in about 48 to 72 hours to make us look as real as possible as he was hitting the floor there. And we managed to close deals with 3 or 4 suppliers who we still work with today. And that was October of 2017 that he did that, which is pretty fascinating. So the fake it till you make it story, we definitely embrace the fake it till you make it. With the interesting also being I was at yet another conference in real time for a completely other business, calling Michael every couple of hours to say, how's it going? What did you learn? What do we need to take back, to talk to other folks? Is there anything we need to adjust for your next pitch in like an hour and a half? So it was, the exciting heady days when it was just me and Michael, right? Kind of doing whatever we wanted. But clearly I get excited about that era of the business because that one was when it was, complete, blue sky business. And we took the PR plus FAC kind of idea to say, what's the more immediate vision? And then the other thing I talk about with entrepreneurs, and I don't know how many of the folks on the call are like either entrepreneurs themselves or aspiring entrepreneurs, but we also took the kind of Brian Chesky Airbnb 11-star model and said, if what, just getting furniture in the door is 1 star, what is 2 stars, 3 stars, all the way up to 11. And that somewhat sets the tone for where our business potentially could go for the next 10 years, 11 years, 15 years, if you want to use Airbnb as a model, right? They're continuing to extend the things that they're doing, a lot of which is probably referenced in their original 11-star doc.
That's awesome. That's definitely quite the story. So thanks for sharing more with us on that. So we have a lot to kind of jump in here. I did have a question for you as far as, as a marketplace, having the right supply and in this case, the furniture based off of, what people are looking to rent. How do you go about curating that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And by the way, being a little bit less familiar, Mike, with this audience, and I know it's a growing community, I think marketplace, and I think kind of Amazon 3P sellers on their marketplace, it's worth noting that we actually have the direct relationship with all the suppliers in our context. And there's a really important reason for that. We looked at whether we could do a two-sided or a multi-sided marketplace at the beginning of this and say, could we take used furniture, refurbish that furniture and put it back into homes? Someone had actually tried that business model before us, raised money and returned it to the venture capital investors because they said it just can't be done. You can't keep the quality of furniture to be necessary to kind of turn these things around. A lot of people were acquiring furniture that no one was interested in. So how do you gather the data you need in order to decide it's worth you buying and holding this inventory? Other models have come later that have improved upon what was there at the time. Arguably, OfferUp probably has something similar to that with some of their practices. But in our case, when it came to supplier identification, because sustainability and subscription are inherent to our business model, we need things that can last multi-turns, right? So modularity is important, like spare parts programs are important. Durability is important, right? So some of our earliest vendors we were really excited about, like one of them, I'm not going to name check, but they had a cold rolled steel frame that could be dropped from like a 10-story building. You assume you see a sofa, it drops the whole way, the cushions would explode, the upholstery would tear across the seams, but the metal frame would be just fine, right? And this cold roll steel could last 100 years. So knowing that that was modular enough that we could buy cushions from them or we could buy replacement upholstery from them meant that we wouldn't have to completely like amortize or depreciate the entire piece of furniture. We could arguably just do parts of the furniture because we knew we could replace through spare parts. So if someone had a spare parts program or excess parts program, that was really important. The durability component, if it wasn't modular, is really important, right? So like, does it have and by the way, I'm far enough away from parts of the supply chain now that the nomenclature I used to have memorized are not top of mind for me anymore. But like, think of the density of foam. There's a point at which there's like a diminishing return. There's the opposite side. It's almost like thread count. When you go beyond a certain thread count, it actually doesn't make any difference. It's just a marketing ploy. Same with density. You go past a certain density with foam and it basically doesn't have any difference. But if you go the opposite direction, but that's when you get the divots that never seem to kind of rise back. So you need to get somewhere within that range. And so finding like durable cushions. This point being, this is where we went really deep in the logistics and supply chain side of things, and specifically supply chain was finding people who were willing to do business with someone like us who had no operating history. This is where me and Michael's narration skills came into play, in in the context of something like High Point, and being willing to put some dollars against some inventory that we ultimately never flipped. This was some early learnings for us, putting equity dollars against buying inventory because we didn't have revenue yet to justify it, and we hadn't figured out some of the other more sophisticated financing tools that were available to us at the time. But long story short, to get at your question, Mike, it's really about those durability things. And then on top of it is that, but there is some amount of fashion in the world of furniture as well. Fortunately, it's not as fast as it is in the actual fashion world, right? Hence the term fast fashion, coming in fashion and not other businesses. So we didn't have the kind of Forever 21 model where things needed to change every 6 weeks. Mid-century modern has been popular in the United States for multiple decades now. And West Elm and CB2 really embrace that because those are kind of the archetypes or paradigms for which most people in the millennial or older Gen Z or earlier Gen X are familiar with. We just needed to make sure that we were playing within a style type that was appealing to our customers. Few other details there, like most of our customers live in apartment buildings. So we had to be conscious of things like smaller footprint furniture. Like you couldn't do the really large lazy boy recliner at the time because no one would have a place to put that in a 600 square foot studio apartment, right? So it was a lot more thoughtful about the sort of like footprint of that furniture. Interestingly enough, some of those behaviors have changed in the last 3 years. Our most popular item right now is a massive sectional called the Remy. Like people are loving this thing. And, admittedly, we're having trouble keeping it in stock because it's that exciting. We didn't really expect it to hit as much. So, but we have migrated, and maybe this is a little bit beyond what you're looking for, but we started with kind of buying from wholesale manufacturers who white labeled, and we might be carrying the same piece that was provided by Macy's or Bloomingdale's or some other big box retailer under a different name. We're now at the point where we're designing to spec and having manufacturers make it to our spec or a similar spec, because there's, in the world of furniture, very little of what you see is patentable because it's all basically the same technology that's existed for hundreds of years, right? Unless you're creating, shout outs to the team at Outer here in LA, like they have multiple patent pending processes for water and dust to wicker off the outdoor covers on their outdoor furniture. That's patentable, but legs and how legs are jointed onto things, very little of that actually is protected in the kind of the IP world. So anyways, point being, we had to be really thorough about who we picked because we needed the furniture to be able to depreciate over a really long period of time as opposed to a short period of time. And then I will add one more thing, which is we wanted to maintain a fairly low SKU count for multiple reasons. And this is different than many marketplaces at large, right? Like Amazon is the everything store, right? Etsy tries to have anything and everything for every single person. And I'm using legacy marketplaces. Clearly, there's many others out there now. But we needed to make sure that we had really tight control over those pieces because we knew we had to be able to refurbish them. Well, to refurbish something, you have to develop some competency and experience around how you refurbish it. So if it's a hardwood top, how do you buff it to get it just right if there's a deep scratch in it? Do you buff it? There's actually these tools that fill the divot and then you buff it and it blends them together. Again, pardon my language, but I don't know shit about this stuff, but I had to learn a lot of it really quickly with Michael in the early days. And so we had to maintain that tight SKU count. And then I'll share one other thing that's interesting probably for a marketplace audience, which we learned from our friend over at Wayfair, which was that there was almost an inverse correlation between the number of SKUs in a given category and how that category performed on like a per SKU basis, which kind of makes sense. I guess that's not an inverse correlation, but if you end up looking at, I don't know, your 1200th gray sofa, by that point, your eyes start glazing over. You've been clicking the next button page after page after page. So we said, analysis paralysis is not something we want to deal with. People are not getting the furniture generally in our business that they intend on keeping forever for their forever home. So what we need is something that's sufficiently representative to make people feel like they're creating their own home, and it doesn't feel like kind of a rubber stamp or like a stamped model that looks exactly like all of their friends' homes, right? So we needed just enough coverage to feel personal, but little enough that we could maintain really solid operations behind the scenes so we could maximize the life cycle of the furniture pieces for both sustainability and business reasons, because it benefits us on both.
Awesome. You touched on a few points that I was actually going to ask, so that's perfect. So
Feel
one of
free to
them was,
double down on any of them, Mike, because I can manage to talk for hours on end. So
uh,
interject at any moment.
so could I, especially about the refurbishing of furniture. So I'm weirdly fascinated by things like that. So we'll skip over that. You did mention the inventory, and that was great. So I did have a question, and it's on the personalization and kind of accessorizing your home for your unique kind of taste.
Mhm.
So do you offer accessories such as like art and like more home decor now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me get at a couple of things there, because I think you were alluding to something, and then let me get to the accessory side of things. So we started with what I always called like the anchor pieces for a room. So you have to have a bed and a mattress to do a bedroom. You have to have a sofa to do a living room. You have to have a dining table to do a dining area, right? And so, we heavied up on those. And then there's the immediate accessory oriented pieces of they're not accessories, but other furniture pieces you would use around those, right? So if you got a sofa, you'd probably get a side chair if you had space for it. And you'd probably get a side table to put a lamp on, right? If you got a dining table, you get chairs. So it's just the extending concentric circles beyond these core pieces, and then you move from there. So at about halfway through last year, we did start moving into more accessories oriented things. So we are, I think we're either the only, or maybe there's one or two wholesale customers of CB2 and Crate and Barrel through a very circuitous way that we managed to develop a relationship with them, and through Gordon Siegel, the founder of Crate and Barrel, which is, he's a legend in and of himself. Um, but we said, like, you know, going back to my point I made a long time ago, the whole mission of the business is making it effortless to create a home. Well, a home isn't just the bed you lay in or just the sofa you sit on, right? So to your point, what is the knickknacks, the tchotchke, the sort of things you put on shelves to make it look more like a home? So we started adding a bunch of things to accessorize and decorate your home, including things you would place on bookshelves, tabletops, things of that nature. We, as of more recently, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I'm going to say it anyways, like we are going to be offering art on the site. And by art, I mean not the sculptural oriented tchotchke arts, and I'm using tchotchke in a pithy way, but actual wall art. And we are partnering with a number of vendors to find a selection of art that will work well. And the good news about art for our business model, Mike, is that it goes on the wall and it sits there. And then when our guys come pick it up at the tail end of the subscription, they lift it off, right? As opposed to all these other furniture pieces that require assembly or potentially disassembly and refurb. Art's going to ideally be something that we can push for a lot longer on our platform. So the answer is yes, we are moving into that. And beyond that, there's also the accessories you need basically to function, right? Well, most people are not going to sleep on a bed frame with a mattress with no sheets on it, right? Some people are, I'm sure, do, but including some of our early customers we talked about who were really embarrassed about bringing home prospective girlfriends, and those prospective girlfriends saying, what are you like? This is a really good anecdote. He's like, what are you, a UT kid? Because this was in Austin, and she's like 35, and like, I'm not gonna play with you, yeah, like 22-year-old college kid. You need to get your shit together and put your home together. That was one of our good anecdotes, where he went out the next weekend and spent $12,000 in furniture because he wanted to be able to score a girlfriend, quoting him. So we now actually retail some for sale items that are not refurbishable, or the sort of things that people probably wouldn't feel comfortable having refurbished. So sheets, hand towels, like the sort of things you need to accessorize your bathroom or fill out your bathroom or bedroom. So those are now part of the ecosystem, and there are more of them being introduced because we're making it effortless to create a home. So we're trying to find the incremental things you need to make your house a home. So looking behind you, Mike, I can't tell if that's a virtual background or your real background, because your lighting is just perfect if it is your real background. But the lights that are hanging there, do we get in the world of lights that require assembly, or do we only do floor lamps and table lamps, right? And so we have to be really thoughtful, because I don't necessarily want my team drilling in walls or doing assembly, because that just opens liability. So I'm trying to, do things in an incremental fashion that's like more achievable for the business, one step at a time.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. And thanks for the compliment. So it's actually real.
You're doing a good job. I mean, a lot of the things you have in your background. It's actually interesting, though. I'm going to call this out. Like the green piece, the table you have to your left, right? When you think about the SKU counts that we have, it's kind of a miniature big bold bet for us to take on a more vibrant color piece, because like, is that actually going to hit? Navy always works. Like dark brown always works. There's like these colors that work in furniture. But if you experiment with a mauve or an eggplant, or this year, I think the Pantone color is some variant of a yellow, is that going to work? Can I actually clean that yellow if someone spills wine on it? Is it actually going to be good next year? So I'm having to think not just about contemporaneous tastes, but potentially tastes that will persist over a period of time, which is unique to our business, unlike maybe some other businesses. I think I lost the thread on your original question, Mike, admittedly, but ideally that was still interesting anyways. And
Oh,
Rohan's
no, I love it.
smiling at me, so I hope that means that it was okay the direction I took things.
Yeah. No, we're good. So you did bring up a point as far as the the in-home assembly, and which kind of surfaces a question as far as or I guess the topic of the focus on the not only the initial kind of customer experience of selecting furniture and accessories online, but the actual in-person experience
Yeah.
through Fernish. So could you share more about maybe how that kind of came about as the so core to your business, and then how that's kind of evolved over time?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, you can imagine with that story I was telling, and I don't mind name checking that Michael had been buying and throwing away IKEA. It's what most people would have assumed he would have been buying and throwing away. And everyone's put together probably a Billy bookcase at some point in their life. It is the #1 selling piece of furniture globally, and it's referenced in history books. I think there's one in the MoMA, like that sort of thing. Doing those little Allen wrenches on everything is exhausting, right? And so we said, I mean, big part of why people don't like moving is the putting of things in boxes, taking things out, disassembling and reassembling things. So we said, like, in order to make it effortless to create a home, and knowing that our type of customer is a lot more time sensitive than they are cost sensitive, they really want the flexibility and ease. So they're willing to pay potentially a slight premium on getting the things into the home in a white glove fashion. So we have a team that brings the furniture into the home and assembles it or places it wherever you want. They take away any of the excess packaging, so there's nothing left behind. We don't have boxes that you have to figure out how to discard behind your building, which is obviously the sort of thing you would do if you bought from Wayfair or Amazon or anyone else who shipped furniture to your home. You don't have to worry about getting your friend to come over so you guys can do the friends pivot exercise up 6 flights of stairs, right? Like, we will cover all of that. So that just went towards creating this effortless experience. And obviously it ends up, I'm a business nomenclature here. If we can drive up higher net promoter scores through having good relationship with customers and making this easy for them, that will ideally drive more business for us. But we did think that was like tantamount to the business, right? Like, making it easy and effortless requires that sort of assistance. And it's on the front end and the back end, right? Our guys show up to do the drop off. They come back at the end to pick it up and take it away. And generally, you don't have to do anything except for maybe say, I don't like where that sofa is, move it again. I don't like where that sofa is, move it again. And our team is happy and amenable, and they're there for you to do that. So that was critical. And I think the other piece that's worth mentioning here, Mike, is Michael, at the time we were debating, like, do we outsource this? Especially in the kind of the lean MVP era of the business, like, do we get TaskRabbits? Do we use Thumbtack? Like, are we getting, gig laborers to do this work for us? Do we use folks like Dolly, which our COO was the previous COO of Dolly. So any of the sort of like Buddy Truck was here in LA for a period of time. There's a number of these pickup trucks as a service sort of businesses. But with that, you get variable experience as anyone who's worked with any sort of gig workers in any field, right? You order food, you get a vastly different experience from, deliverer to deliverer, and, whether it's Postmates or DoorDash, it's different every time, right? Or grocery delivery or anything with a gig economy sort of thing. So we needed consistency of experience for one. Two, we wanted control over, and this is within the experience, like we wanted to make sure that the people there were happy to go in and say, I want to make your home what you want it to, to be, and kind of indoctrinating that into the employer requires that they actually be full-time employees of you, right? And the interesting thing is that while we were making this decision, a very popular, arguably the most lauded furniture business in the United States, Restoration Hardware, had just decided themselves to say, we used to be using a third-party logistics company and third-party last mile delivery company. That's not working anymore for a number of reasons, because it doesn't create an optimal experience for our customers. So we're going to insource that. And it happened to be at the same time that I was saying, Michael, I think we have to bite the bullet and just bring in our own staff here, which means we can't even use 3PL warehouses. We have to manage our own warehouse facility, because most warehouses will not let you do ingress and egress on used goods that can't be pallet stacked and can't be, parcel boxes, etc. So, there's some folks here, given that we're marketplace operators, are familiar with the likes of like Flow Space or Flex, right? These kind of extensible warehouse providers who are kind of doing a little bit of thoughtful arbitrage play against warehouse space, right? Didn't work for them because they said, well, our operators can't move your furniture, which is in a bunch of different states, and some of it's assembled, some of it's not. So we said we have to bite the bullet and do that ourselves. But that meant, again, we went deep in our vertical and said that enables us to create the best possible experience for our customers and control costs. So when everything goes to variable labor cost management and COGS, we wanted to make sure we had control of like those two pieces, plus the third pillar of the customer experience itself.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks for sharing with us about that. So I did have a question, and you kind of mentioned it, I believe, before, but I wanted to jump into a little bit more before we head into some group questions. And that is on, given the, I would say, like operational and kind of logistic requirements of the business, what markets do you operate in, and what is like the team kind of makeup like right now?
Yeah, and I may have blazed through that a little bit too quickly earlier. So we launched initially in LA. Then we launched in Seattle about 6 months after that. We extended through Orange County to include like south of Irvine, just recently added San Diego, and we'll be moving to another market here relatively imminently. So we'll have coverage of something like 70 million Americans or something like that between the markets that we're operating in. Kicking off fundraising imminently here for our next round, which will obviously set us up to do additional market expansion over the subsequent years. I do have a thesis here, which I talked to with the venture capital community, which is I think retention is going to be much better on our business over time. And by the way, we already have a pretty phenomenal retention on our subscription platform. But the number one reason why we lose customers right now is because they move to markets we don't support. So if we could support more markets, clearly we could retain more customers, and it just extends the value proposition. Mike, you could imagine you're ready to pack everything up, or maybe I do. I'm going to move from LA, let's say, and I decide I want to move to New York. I actually don't have to pack anything up. The furniture is all taken away. Maybe I have a handful of boxes of my records and my clothes, and I can just FedEx those to my new place, instead of having to do a kind of long haul, less than truckload shipment across the country for $5,000, right? But that does take us being in more markets. And what we have found is this move between Seattle and LA, the customers who have taken advantage of that, they absolutely love it, because it means that the move is significantly easier because they're not having to manage quite as few pieces. So West Coast only right now. There's some moves that are coming shortly that'll be changing that.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, the value brought for not having to pack up and move yourself is definitely there. So
yes.
So just right before we do jump into the questions, I did want to ask about the kind of fundraising process and what that's been like.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's the equity component of the business, which is definitely key for any business in this space, and a lot of that obviously goes towards like research and development and the staff itself. So I don't know how much details you want here. Michael does the numbers much better. I like broad strokes of many of these sorts of details. So the first safe note was about $1 million. That was raised off of the 2-page press release plus a 4-page deck. It was the ugliest deck you've ever seen. And that was actually our icebreaker in every conversation. We're like, neither one of us are designers. Please forgive this. We'll hire the right designer later, right? And that would get a chuckle out of people. And then it would, the room was a little bit warmer and we could move on from there. So we did $1 million off of that. It was mostly friends and family and one pseudo institutional investor, but it was very intentional friends and family because, as I noted, like we needed some logistics and buying and experience we didn't have on that side of things, and a few people with finance backgrounds who would be thoughtful about alternative instruments we would need. We ended up doing Techstars LA in the summer of 2018, I believe. So we took on a little bit of incremental capital then. Did our formal like priced round seed in 2019, which is when we brought in Real Estate Tech Ventures, or RET. So RET Ventures, their LPs are all public and private REITs who own and operate really large apartment complexes. So the sort of names you might think of are like, depending on what market you're in, because there's a lot of regionalization here, but the big ones nationally are like Equity and Essex and Avalon Bay. These are the sort of ones that you would recognize them because they take over entire city blocks and they are 600 to 800 units large. They're investors in RET, which means we have an LP base through our VC who has access to a bunch of units. And guess what? Those units need furniture. And guess what? They've got leasing agents who are looking to fill those units. Could they potentially fill those units easier if they said, we've got an amenity that we can offer you. We've got a relationship with Fernish, right? So RET represented both venture capital, but an interesting distribution partnership for us because we realized through some of our market research that 75% of our customers lived in what are called A and A plus class buildings. These are the buildings that have on-site leasing facilities, they have on-site gyms, they have parking, et cetera. And because they have on-site leasing offices, meant they basically have built-in salespeople for us. So we brought on RET then, and then fast forward, growth through the year 2019, and then obviously 2020 comes along, right? So COVID hits, and we managed to successfully raise our Series A 2 months into COVID. Khosla led our Series A, brought on a number of really interesting strategic angels like Spencer Raskoff, who was one of the co-founders of Zillow, Eitan and Gil Elbaz, who started Applied Semantics and sold it to Google in 2001. It became what is known as AdSense today. Just a lot of really interesting. We've always done our best to get as many strategics as we can because we think they add a lot of value, a lot of operator value specifically. The other component that's interesting for our business, and I think relevant probably for many marketplace businesses where you're having to buy and hold inventory, is looking into non-dilutive financing options. So I recently wrote a piece for a publication here in LA called .LA, where I just focused on non-dilutive financing. So inventory financing, accounts receivable based financing, which you can do for things like subscription businesses with predictable forward revenue. Asset financing. There are companies like Clearbank where you can do marketing financing where they're effectively doing rev share against money that they lend you to do for your Facebook and Google advertising, and then they take a kickback on the rev share side of things. Those are all really important because I have a very capital intensive business. We're buying the furniture, but you're not paying it back immediately. So for anyone who's reading the Invent and Wander, which is the collection of all of Bezos's letters, you will notice for like the first 10 of them, he talks a lot about cash flow and the difference between payment terms. Like, hey, I'm selling to a customer now, but they're on net 90. So if I could turn it twice, then I've got that much cash in hand before I ever have to pay out the vendor, which enables me to buy more inventory. And there's the flywheel effect. We almost have something working against us, which is I have to do the capital outlay for the furniture up front in order to lease it to you and then pay back over time, right? So we had to be really creative with a number of things like inventory financing and marketing financing and accounts receivable financing, and a number of these things that are interesting and that they're non-dilutive and they don't hit my stake in the company, to use me very personally or any of the owners in the company, but it is capital you need in order to operate the business as it gets bigger and bigger.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super interesting. So cool. So we have a few questions right here. So we're just going to jump into those if that sounds good. Otherwise, you and I could probably talk forever. So cool. Hey, Jake, did you want to come on?
Yeah. Thank you, Luke. Really appreciate this combo here. So I'm the founder of WineKey, which is a virtual wine tasting marketplace, and we primarily serve corporations doing internal team bonding and client events. So wanted to ask, what tools have you built for your supply side? And when did you decide to start building those tools?
It's a very good question. And depending on what you mean by supply side, so I'm going to take a creative interpretation on that.
My wineries, yeah.
So in our case, when I went to launch this platform, having had a technology background, I was looking at ERP systems that would be able to do circular based business models, right? So like linear based models is what most ERPs were based on. So the expectation is that I'm buying it, I'm holding it, shipping it to a customer, and then I never have to think about it again, right? Or that it may come back through a return, but a return is an exception case, even though returns clearly happen quite a bit. So I was like, I don't see anything in the marketplace that I'm interested in right now. That has changed somewhat in the interim as there's been more and more subscription businesses, but we ended up building our own custom ERP system, including an asset management system to keep track of all of our inventory ourselves. That also represents, Jake, for us, we think, kind of institutional and strategic value for the business, because we build a robust circular ERP that becomes interesting not just for our business, but for other businesses who are also managing assets similar to ours. And it potentially opens us up to another software service model down the road, independent of our consumer service model that we're doing today. I don't know if that was what you were aiming for. Point being, we didn't actually use anything out of the box. It was a lot of cobbling together infrastructure as service, platform as service, but we're not using any of the off-the-shelf, ERP or inventory management systems. Is that where you're headed, Jake?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'm just wondering now because because like the logistics and planning of virtual tasting can be a nightmare, from collecting shipping addresses for a 75-person tasting, coordinating the winery's calendar as well as the client. So we're just like thinking about how can we automate this and like build tools that could potentially help our supply. And then like you mentioned, like there's always like the virtual cocktail tasting and the food kits that also need to collect shipping information, where we can potentially turn that into some sort of SaaS offering down the road too, is how we're thinking about it.
Yeah, and I would say that in our business, probably I over-index on the like technology generation, and I would say a lot of that is because of probably my Amazon experience, where not built here syndrome runs pretty deep in that organization. Then again, they've done a lot of good things with it because they've turned around and commercialized basically anything they've built, which is my mindset too, right? I'm building an interesting ERP system that plugs into my CRM system, and everything flowing through similar data pipes. Can I turn around and potentially monetize that in other as a service models? All of a sudden, my platform becomes far more interesting, maybe as a software model, than it is even what I, thought, day one as a furniture business. So
Exactly.
we work really heavily on the R&D side of our business, including that asset management portion I was talking about, where we have our own devices and we're scanning QR codes and we're managing the entire workflow through the warehouses ourselves. That's a big bite to take it, or rather whatever the expression is, a big bite to chew of, or Can't get my language. I'm still waking up, by the way. I'm more like a noonish is when my brain starts to wake up. But I think you get the point. We decided to invest pretty heavily in that. I think we had in the first, and maybe this is the one part of Mike's question around the composition of the team. Like we have the engineering team is 10 people deep, and of headquarters, that's about 45 people. So they represent about 25% of the team, and that's not including product managers and designers and data science who's also involved in the process, right? So the R&D side of the house is roughly a third of headquarters, if not close to half, because we invested really heavily in these things. It's not, we didn't pick Shopify or Magento or BigCommerce or WooCommerce and then kind of plug and play off of the offering there. I wish had we had a linear business, that's totally the route I would have gone. Especially now that I've seen that Amazon and Shopify can do in-a-box services fairly easily, but I need circular, so the in-a-box doesn't really work for my business model very well.
Cool. Thank you, man.
You're welcome.
Awesome. That was a great question. And thanks for sharing more with us, Lucas. Cool. So we're actually kind of running short on time here. Rohan, do you want to jump on there?
Yeah. Hey, Lucas, thank you so much for doing this. And I'm a PM at AppDeco, so we have a very, very similar kind of business, but in New York and kind of expanding. And I'm actually working a lot on the expansion side, so I'm like very, very deep into routing and scheduling. And that's kind of what my question was around as well, is like how have you found your approach to routing and scheduling being like in terms of making it scalable as you grow in geography and also as you kind of grow in volume? For example, like for us, we actually built our own system on the back end, like on the admin side, to optimize our scheduling, assigning it to teams, and then we work with like a different software to kind of map it all out from a routing perspective.
Yeah.
But we found challenges in scaling that just as we grow geographically. And I mean, obviously, like getting back to the point of like you have one central warehouse, how far can you go from that before having to expand another one? So just kind of curious, like how you've tackled that so far, or how you plan on tackling that as you grow, I guess, eastward. And then I have a second question. It's kind of different from this one, but like how often do you see customers just doing a purchase outright of an asset? Like they rented it for a little while. They're like, I actually want to move with it. I love it. I'm going to buy it. Like how often do you see that happen?
Yeah, I'll tackle the first one first. So I think we probably took a strategy very similar to you, where even though I said not built here syndrome, when it came to our initial routing tool, we actually did license something. We are using something off of the shelf for that. Though it's being used in a fashion that's probably not entirely as designed, to be fair, Rohan.
Us too, very much.
Our humans are very much still saying, that doesn't seem right to me, and then they adjust it anyways. And as I've seen the behavior, I just said, I actually don't think this is the platform for us. So I think after this quarter, where we're focused on some other strategic initiatives, we'll probably want to go back and redesign our own routing software. The good news is that some of the underlying tech to inform that is far more mature now than it would have been 10 years ago, right? Like any of the big, Google has location services, Amazon has location services, Microsoft does, and then you could use the pure play location service businesses that are out there as well. Rohan, I didn't mention when I was doing ad tech, I was actually doing hyperlocal mobile targeting. So I got really deep into location technology and how it could be used. And the ad tech company I was in was actually a division of a larger navigation company called Telenav, who's one of their co-founders co-invented GPS, right? So I went really, really deep into a location. I made 2 investments in the location services space. So I'm hyper familiar with what's possible there, but we are going to be building out our own routing and dispatch. And right now we've like the dispatch side is there. It's more of the routing side. We don't have, so unlike say a food delivery service where they have to optimize quite a bit, otherwise their margins shrink, or there were a number of other businesses that I'm familiar with that had to get multiple turns within a day. We don't have quite that burden because we can only really get 3 or 4 loads in a given day. But I definitely don't want, if for anyone who knows LA, like I don't want a truck going to Venice and then turning around going to the opposite side of downtown LA, because that's an hour-long commute during, peak traffic, right? So we are doing that, and that's where I was getting at, Rohan, that like the humans are putting in the data and then deciding, actually, I think there's a better route here. I'm going to go ahead and circumvent it anyways. So we're building that ourselves right now. And then your second question was, actually, I lost. What was the second question again, Rohan?
It was on how many customers do you see like purchase an asset outright after renting?
Yeah. So this is an area where I would say we've changed our dogma a little bit relatively recently, because we said we're a subscription business, right? But we always offered the option to rent to own or lease to own or subscribe to own, depending on whatever you wanted to call it. And what we found is that, like, if our goal, and this goes back to having like a mission that, or a North Star that you can rally around, is making it effortless to create the home, I'm fine if you want to buy it out at the end of the term. And in fact, like in some cases, that's actually better for me, because that item might be one that's less likely to be refurbishable. And then I don't have to pay the reverse logistics to take it from your home back to my warehouse and refurbish it. So I don't increase my variable cost, in which case it just ends up looking more like a traditional retail sale, which is a healthy business to have, assuming we drive sufficient demand for it, right? So it is happening quite a bit that customers are renting stuff in order to own, and we're actually changing some of the language on our website right now to actually emphasize that for the subset of customers who keep on asking, is this something you have? And we just don't talk about it a lot. The answer is yes, we do. We're now going to start emphasizing it more so we can reduce bounce rates for those customers who thought that was a thing they might want, but it was unclear. But yeah, this is we are in the era, and this is probably because of, thanks to Jerome Powell and his predecessors with really low interest rates, we can do things like Affirm and Afterpay because they're getting huge loads of debt at very low interest rates. And so they can pass it on to you at very low interest rates. So our generation, where we might not want to use credit cards, we're perfectly happy to do 0% interest loans through Affirm for 18 months to pay off a good, right? So long story short, we're happy with people buying goods if that's the direction that they head. And then some of the goods, as I was telling Mike earlier, kind of inherently are purchased initially. The pillowcases and bed sheets and things of that nature.
Awesome, thank you.
Mike, I saw a question pop up on the Zoom itself. Did you want me to answer that one?
Yeah, we're almost out of time, but yeah, that'd be great. I think Tomas had a question about competition he's out here on the west side too in LA. So
okay, yes,
yep, yeah, thanks so much.
And this was the Casa One Feather Oliver Space question. Yeah, so since we started, when Michael had this idea, no one was in market with this from the kind of the VC backed ecom oriented business space, right? The legacy players were still there. By the time we were ready to about quit our jobs was when Feather graduated from Y Combinator. And so they were live in San Francisco as of that moment. And then they had been live in New York because they're Brooklyn based. They developed a relationship with Williams Sonoma and the Pottery Barn and West Elm brands that fall under Williams Sonoma. Then we followed, then Casa One came after us, and then Oliver Space, which is out of San Francisco, came next. This is where I think the market is early enough that there's so much available space that I'm not entirely concerned. Like thematically, I love the idea of there being people that are pushing the idea of furniture subscription, because it just takes away the education and learning curve if everyone's marketing this simultaneously. And because we are creating a market for most customers, because going back to my earlier, numerics there, like 98% of people had never heard of this thing, right? So if all of those guys are doing it in other markets that we don't exist in yet, it's not really a cost for me in that I'm not operating that market as of this moment. We will compete in more markets over time, but ideally all of our mutual dialogue, I just put it towards a rising tide floats all boats at this point. But I think fundamentally, Tomas, it's going to come down to a lot of those executional details, right? Like, is that white glove experience optimal such that, you get good positive reviews and people say you're doing things the right way? Is your selection the right selection? Are you able to continue to operate your business in a financially solvent way by being really thoughtful about COGS and variable costs and how you're financing it? Do you get into a position where you make promises like we deliver in 7 days, except for you can't do that anymore because you're using third-party services, and ends up being more like 14 days and you have promises that you can't meet. So I think what we've always said is like, this is very much my Amazon hat on. I'm just going to focus on the customer and be as customer centric as possible and double down on them. And ideally we will win by thinking about the customer while in the more periphery thinking about what the other guys are doing. And to be fair, like they've experimented with interesting language and I pay attention to their language and they pay very close attention to the language that we use on Fernish as well in terms of trying to communicate the value prop. So I don't know, it's at this point, nascent players, you know, if I were to use kind of growth or PE oriented logic, none of us are big enough at this point that anyone would really be concerned. I will pay attention to them over time, though, Tomas, as we expand into more markets and all of our mutual footprints grow.
Cool. That makes sense. Thanks.
Awesome. That was a great way to wrap it up. And wow, this is a really good chat. So thanks again for taking the time to join us, Lucas. This is really fun. So before we leave though, where can we keep up with you? Time for a quick little plug.
Yeah, sure. So anyone, you know, if you got questions for me, it's lucas@fernish.com. Well, Fernish is spelled with an E, so Fernish. It was a play on a fern being like a green thing. So for the sustainability, I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'm very engaged on LinkedIn. So if you reach out to me, I tend to that's the one social presence that I actually spend any time on. So LinkedIn pretty heavy, and then on a very regular basis, I blog all over the place, whether my own Medium or various third-party media platforms. But I'd say LinkedIn and lucas@fernish.com. Find me.
Awesome.
And this community, as soon as I go create my account, as Mike has encouraged me to actually get off my butt and do.
Yeah, no, sorry. We actually just switched platforms, so it's probably confusing to come in, post an intro, and then me be like, hey, wait, we actually switched. So, but okay. Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again for taking the time to join us. This was really great, and had a fun time learning more about Fernish. So we'll all be cheering you on here in the group, and you know, big fans of what you're building. So thanks again.
Have a good one. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.